Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. When I was a child, I used to have a recurring nightmare. The world used to be black and it'd be all alone. And I'd have these multicolored spirits. I was a kid, okay? And they'd come towards me and it would be very, very scary for me. They'd advance. I'd feel very, very anxious, and then the dream would end. That dream used to disturb me. And I would sometimes even have flashbacks of it whilst I was awake. And these flashbacks would only last like a second or two, but for a moment, I'd feel that same kind of anxiety. So at that time, my 10-year-old self felt that enough was enough, had to do something, so I came up with a plan. And what I thought was that if I could somehow stop those multicolored spirits in my dream, maybe that would get rid of these weird experiences of being back in that dream when I was awake. So I forgot about it until one night they visited me again. This time it was more intense than normal. And again, I was all alone. The world was pitch black. They were around me, as a huge crowd of them, and as is standard in a dream, the content was absurd. I was fighting them, but the format was a tennis match. I don't know if Wimbledon was on or something. But they kept on hitting the ball back at me, and I tried to hit it back. And there's a whole crowd of them. There's one of them who kept on hitting it back harder and harder, and I couldn't get to it. And I remember seeing it. It came, and it bounced, and I remember reaching out my racket and thinking, I'm not going to be able to hit that. But then something very strange happened. In my dream, at that moment, I suddenly remembered the real world. And I remembered saying to myself, if I defeat them in this dream, then maybe they'll stop in the real world. And as soon as I made that resolve, I suddenly basically had a huge surge of strength. And I got there, and I hit it back harder than I'd done before. Ball bounced into the other court, and I looked up and they were all gone. I had won. It was good. I won, and I didn't have that dream ever again. And those weird flashback things almost completely vanished from my life. I've since found out that what I did has a name. It's called lucid dreaming. It's now the therapy of choice for people who have chronic nightmares. And what it is essentially a technique that is taught to you whilst you're awake to allow you to recognize when you're in a dream and to take control. That experience has always had me questioning dreams. How can a world feel so real, so convincing, but in an instant turn out to be completely unreal? As I grew up and I began to learn more about Islam, I began to see that, for me at least, there was a curious symmetry between our experience of dreams and the Quran's teachings on the afterlife. So when you're in a dream, you see things, you hear things, you feel them. And yet the moment you wake up, you realize that your sight in the dream was completely defective. You realize that your hearing, all your other senses, were completely incomparable to what you have now when you're awake. And you think that world didn't really make sense, and you feel almost embarrassed that you actually fell for it. How could you ever think that the dream world was real when this world is so much clearer, so much brighter? It's a higher form of reality in every sense of the word. So I want you to imagine something, if you will. Imagine you go to bed tonight and you start dreaming. And in your dream, someone comes up to you and he tells you that this is not the real world, but there is a greater reality out there. Every sense will be heightened in this world. All the affairs of this world will seem completely pointless when you wake up. What would your reaction be? You'd probably laugh, you'd probably find it funny, and then you wake up. Now, what does Islam tell us? It tells us that this world is not the final destination. It will pass. It tells us that our purpose here on earth is to know, love, and worship our Creator. You You see, opposites are known by their contrast. And we only truly recognize the value of Allah when we experience the disappointment of the world. And we have in our lives every opportunity to indulge in worldly pleasures, but when on the basis of our belief in the unseen, we choose Allah over the worldly pleasures, then we find a delight that has no equal. And when we do this more and more, something special begins to happen. A veil begins to lift from our eyes. What we thought was real becomes totally unreal. That which we thought life was all about becomes dead in our eyes. We begin to see everything in a new light. When we hear, we understand so much more. And when we develop a real two-way connection with Allah the Almighty, we begin to experience a whole new reality. I want to take you back to what we said a little bit earlier. Imagine that you're asleep in the dream world. Someone comes to you, and he tells you that there is a greater reality than this, a hidden hand, which is behind everything, which is waiting for you to come to him. Maybe at first you don't believe him, but he proves it. He points out certain things, and you become a believer. And then he goes one step further. He tells you that your conduct in this dream world will determine the condition in which you wake up. You could be a cripple, or you could be a Superman. You could be blind, or you could be seeing. You could be with the ones you love, or completely bereft and alone. The choice, he says, is yours. What would you do? Do you think it would be right to sit idle and waste away your days waiting to wake up? Or do you think it would be better to work day and night to experience that true reality? To open your eyes and see real light for the first time? This is exactly what Islam teaches us with regards to the afterlife. You see, in Islam, the afterlife is not something that begins when we physically die. Rather, it begins as soon as we give up our worldly life for our spiritual life. When we consistently choose Allah over this world, we enter the afterlife here and now. We begin to experience Allah's reality. And when we look back on our former selves, we begin to understand what the Holy Prophet ﷺ meant when he said, the difference between the living and the dead, the difference between those who remember their Lord and those who don't, is like that between the living and the dead. The Promised Messiah once wrote on a separate but related topic that our condition during sleep is a mirror for the comprehension of our condition in death. He who seeks true comprehension of the soul should reflect deeply on his condition during sleep. And we live in a world where people laugh at the idea that there can be a soul or any kind of greater reality, where greater reality which we can't see or touch. And yet every night, these same people go to bed and they experience a reality which they see and touch. And every morning they wake up and realize that that wasn't real. When they look back at their dreams, they slip away from them and they only remember snippets here and there. And so too will be the condition of those who waste their lives in a pursuit of a world that was never meant to last. Chapter 23, the Quran says, God will say to these people, what number of years did you tarry in the earth? They will say, we tarried for a day or part of a day. But ask those who keep count. He will say, you tarried but a little. If only you knew. Did you think that we had created you without a purpose? And that you would not be brought back to us? My dear brothers, I want to leave you with a question that we should all be asking ourselves when we look in the mirror every day. My question to you is, are you awake? And I'm not asking you if you're sleeping. I'm asking you if you're awake. Being awake means to have true perception of the reality of things. And we here are blessed to belong to that community of that Messiah, of that Prophet ﷺ, who showed us the true reality of things. Do we go to bed every night a little bit more awake than we were that morning? Or are we content to sleepwalk through life? In the words of the Prophet ﷺ, O sleeping ones, awaken. What is the use of life but to find him? Cursed is the life lived apart from him. Jazakallah.